There are a lot of famous psychopaths out there, a lot. So one that's often talked about is Ted Bundy. Famous serial killer. He was really charming. Almost everyone in whom was charming. He was actually very successful. He rose to the ranks of the Republican Party in Washington State. He was, much to my chagrin, a psychology major at UC Washington. So he was actually apparently very charming, very socially skilled, very smooth. But by the same token, he was also really, really deadly. He was incredibly brazen, incredibly fearless, incredibly bold, but also unbelievably callous. Basically reporting that he had virtually no guilt whatsoever. We do know, in fact, that most psychopaths are not extremely violent, but again, when they are violent, watch out. They can be very, very dangerous. John Dillinger, the famous criminal, earlier in the previous century was, from what I've been able to read, a pretty classic psychopath. Gary Gilmore, the first man to be executed in the United States after the Supreme Court lifted the ban on capital punishment in the 1970s. Completely fearless. His crimes were often pretty pointless and unmotivated. And that's a very common characteristic one sees among psychopaths. Also, on the dangerous front, it's important to understand that there have been some political figures, and in some cases some very dangerous political figures, who certainly exhibited marked characteristics of psychopathy. Again, one wouldn't want to diagnose them from afar, but I think one could say with some confidence they have some of those features, people like Joseph Stalin. Now, the good news, again, is that most psychopaths are not overtly violent. That's good. That does not, however, imply that they can't wreak havoc in lots of other domains. And one of the areas that's getting a lot of attention in recent years, in fact, my grad student Sarah Francis Smith and I are looking at this quite closely in some upcoming research, is the possibility that psychopathy may be fairly common in some real-world settings, especially business and corporate settings. In fact, we know surprisingly little about how prevalent psychopaths are in the business world, whether or not they're more likely to attain positions of power, what they're like as bosses, and what kind of damage they do. Certainly people would argue that some of the people involved in Enron and some of these corporate scandals exhibited marked psychopathic traits. Some have speculated, for example, give you another example, that Bernie Madoff had many psychopathic traits. I've not examined him, so it's hard for me to evaluate that. But what you often do see, I think, is that people are surprised by these individuals. One of the things that makes psychopathic individuals often so dangerous interpersonally is they often seem so damn normal. Even when you study the disorder in great depth and great detail, you can still get fooled by some of the better psychopaths. They often do dumb things that they even themselves will admit were ill-advised, but have a very hard time stopping. They have a very difficult time learning from punishment, even though they're smart and they understand what's going to get them in trouble. They have a very hard time stopping that kind of behavior. What one often sees about psychopaths, and this is what makes them fascinating, but also makes them quite paradoxical, is that on the surface anyway, they're actually quite rational. They know the difference between right and wrong. They just don't care. Hollywood has shaped our portrayal and popular conception of psychopathy more than just about anything else. Almost any early Jack Nicholson movie shows a psychopath at work. Jack Nicholson was a master at portraying the psychopath. So, I mean, even in One Flew of the Cuckoo's Nest, I think if you look at the character there, and in some ways actually quite sympathetic figure, Randall McMurphy, I think what you see about McMurphy is that he actually was, in many ways, a pretty classic psychopath. He, of course, was brought to a mental institution because he was faking psychosis. Obviously, it wasn't psychosis. He was merely malingering. But in fact, he had raped underage girls and was very, very charming, very swaggering, was dishonest, and so on. But of course, he also became a bit of a cult hero because he was anti-establishment and so on. So you see that a lot. Shakespeare, I think, got a really good psychopath in some of his characters. Richard III was a classic psychopath in many ways. Cassius and Julius Caesar, I think, also had many of the features of psychopathy. So whatever psychopathy is, we can be pretty sure it's not new because it goes back in literature for many centuries.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.